Welcome to Murder by Nature, where we discuss true crime, mysterious disappearances, and unsolved cases. I'm Jasmine, your host. Thank you for listening and coming back to part 2 of our chilling story of Betty Gore. Now, again, this is the true story behind the Love and Death series on Max. And if you haven't watched the show, I do highly recommend that you go and do. In last week's episode, we discussed the relationship of Candy and Pat Montgomery. We discussed the relationship of Allan and Betty Gore, who these couples were, how their actions led to this deadly affair between Candy and Allan. And in this episode, we'll actually dive into the affair of Candy and Allan and the tragic events that took place and what comes next. December 12th, 1978. Candy spent the morning getting ready for the long-anticipated wait. She dropped off her daughter at the Little Red Lovejoy schoolhouse on FM Road 1378, and then she went to Allan and dropped off her son at Playdate Preschool. As she drove herself back home, she was going to allow herself about an hour to fix the special lunch she had planned: marinated chicken with lettuce salad with cherry tomatoes and bacon bits, Thousand Island dressing, white wine, and cheesecake for dessert. She wanted everything to be perfect. She packed everything, including a tablecloth, into a picnic basket and then gathered a few of her personal undergarments and a nightgown and slipped them into her purse. She had everything ready by 10:45. At 11 a.m. on the dot, she was entering Richardson in her station wagon, searching for a motel that would be convenient from Allan's office, and then she found it. The motel was right off the freeway, just 2 or 3 minutes from Allan, and it was called the Continental Inn. As Candy parked her station wagon, she walked up to the front desk to check in. Now, unexpectedly, this took a little longer than she thought it would, as the lady behind the counter insisted on seeing her driver's license and getting the money in advance. Candy paid $29 in cash and then filled out the registration card with her real name. The front desk gave her the key to one of the upstairs units set in the back, out of view of the highway. Candy drove the station wagon around the back and started unpacking. The room would nicely do. It was about 10 by 12 feet. The walls were covered in bright yellow fake paneling, old brown carpet, and on the bed was a spread of leaves and pine cones on the bedding. As Candy walked in, she went straight to the phone and called Allan at work. "I'm at the Continental Inn on Express Central Highway," she said, "room 213. Now, Allan just kind of was calm and said, "Be there in a few minutes." Candy hung up and started getting the room ready. First, she arranged her marinated chicken feast on the bed, and then she slipped into her favorite peekaboo outfit. It was a soft pink color and a tad bit sheer. It was long, falling all the way to her ankles, and showed off her body. She looked at herself in the mirror and decided that she was happy with the way that she looked, and with nothing else to set up, she sat on the chair by the window and waited for Allan to arrive. For the first time since Candy approached Allan in the church parking lot, she was starting to get nervous. She felt herself becoming frightened now that she realized whatever they did today, it was going to be irreversible. Everything she had done before, no matter how crazy, no matter how much flirtatious that she had, nothing compared to what she was about to do today. She was able to have a sexual relationship with another man that was not her husband, but on top of that was her best friend's husband. No matter what happened today, this would quickly change the dynamic of their friend group forever. On the other side of town, Allan was driving to the motel to meet Candy and was feeling the same emotions she was. He wasn't quite sure as how brave he was going to be. He worried that he was only doing this to please Candy and not for the reasons that benefited him. He admitted Candy was sexually appealing, but he didn't want to be filled with anxiety all the time. He didn't want to feel the way he was feeling right now. He pulled into the driveway and found the room. As he anxiously walked up to the door, he saw Candy, smiling. She was in her pink nightgown, and in that moment, Allan felt unstoppable. "What the heck," Allan thought. "I'm here. I'm gonna do it." "I've made lunch," she said, smiling half-heartedly, which to his surprise, Allan could tell that Candy was even more nervous than he was. He sat on the other side of the bed and made small talk. Allan dug into the chicken and quickly drank the wine glass. See, Candy was poking at her chicken. She was really nervous, and she was only tearing off one little piece at a time. I feel like what we're eating, she said. They finished the dessert and then busied themselves around, putting aside the paper plates, the containers, as though neither of them wanted to make the first move. After a few minutes, Candy sat quietly by the door and just kind of looked out the window. Now, from the description of this, it kind of makes it seem like she just kind of did everything, cleaned up, and then she just sat there not looking at him. Well, Allan said, "Are you going to just sit there?" Candy smiled. "Yes." Allan walked over to the bed and gently touched her on the shoulder. With the touch of his embrace, Candy's fears went away. The sex was gentle, conventional, and satisfying. Candy was amazed at first by Allan because when she stuck her tongue in his mouth, it was apparent that he'd never been French kissed. On Allan's side, he was positively transported. Candy was so responsive, energetic. She moved so much that Allan found it to be more exciting than any other experience he's ever had. And I know that's a lot of information. After the encounter, Candy insisted that they both take showers before leaving so that they wouldn't smell like sex. As Candy thought about the experience, she wasn't unhappy with it, even though the lack of experience that Allan really had. It wasn't transforming, it wasn't transcending, it wasn't passionate, it wasn't what she expected it to be. After the first meeting at the Continental Inn, it was obvious that both of them would want to continue the affair. A week later, just before the Christmas holidays, they arranged by phone another visit. This time, Candy would be bringing teriyaki beef strips. After the first meeting at the Continental Inn, it was obvious to both of them that they would want to continue this affair. A week later, just before the Christmas holidays, they arranged by phone another visit. This time, Candy would be bringing teriyaki beef strips, and as she drove over to the Continental Inn, she noticed a smaller, sleazier motel across the freeway. Always a practical shopper, she figured a motel room was a motel room, so why not get something cheaper than $29? The Como Motel was a quiet come-down, even by the less luxurious standards of the Continental. Candy got the impression that the Como did not have a lot of overnight visitors when she walked into the office. Candy came face to face with the clerk standing behind a plexiglass screen like a bank teller window. The manager wanted $23.50 cash in advance, plus a $2 deposit for the key. Candy put her money in the trolley under the window, and he passed her the key. As Candy entered the room, she felt like old money. The sleaziest the place made it more fun to her. The room was a little bit more like a cubicle, 10 by 10 at most, done in a harvest gold. The curtains were droopy and fray, the shag carpet was matted like dirty hair, and the bathroom had fake flooring, a leaky faucet, and the only furnishing other than the bed was a tiny vanity, a TV set, and two captain's chairs with, the fake leather cushions. For the last days of 1978 and the first 3 months of 1979, Allan and Candy met up every other week, dined on taco salad, homemade lasagna, and sipped cheap red wine out of plastic cups supplied by the management. Afterwards, they would recline on the bedspread and rest their heads on tiny foam rubber pillows and talk about their lives, their spouses, their children, and their mutual love of their church. They would talk until it was time for Allan to go back to work or for Candy to pick up her son, and then they would stand in the tub, turning on the faulty shower attachment and washing the smell of each other off. Finally, they would gather up their belongings, kiss each other lightly on the lips, and go back to their normal lives, closing the door behind them. As the time continued with the affair, Allan didn't look forward to the sex as much as the relaxation that he felt during those moments. Those 2 hours with Candy were often the only time that he didn't feel responsible for other people's emotions. In this room at the Como Motel, Allan was a man with no past, no future, able to accept Candy's unconditional affection. She showered him in it in simple ways, in a guiltless way. Allan had never been with any other woman except Betty in his life. The affair made Candy feel alive again, too. She was excited about the sex and the adventure of it all, and she continued to see Allan every 2 weeks like clockwork. Unfortunately, after the third or fourth time at the Como, she started to have second thoughts. Her doubts weren't because of any guilt, They actually started, in fact, when she realized that sex with Allan Gore probably wasn't going to get much better than it already was. The first 2 or 3 times it felt great, but then there had been no improvement. She suspected that he was not the man that was capable of fireworks, no matter how much she coached him. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, Candy was growing real feelings for Allan, and that's why she continued to do what she did. In February of 1979, just a few months into their affair, the more serious problem that came was what Candy feared. She was beginning to fall in love with Allan. Sex or no sex, she and Allan had both come to look forward to their daily conversations, their shared confidant, their joint dependency, and lately, they had been exchanging funny little greeting cards or whatever Candy had, or when she had to drive into Richardson, she would go to Allan's office and place little gifts under his windshield wipers. Sometimes Allan would even go out to check his car when he knew he was staying for lunch just to see if she brought any brownies, homemade candy, or anything. Once he found a small ceramic statue of a boy and a girl kissing, and inscripted in the base read, "Practice makes perfect." As time went on, they seemed less like lovers and more like best friends. During one meetup, they decided to not have sex altogether because they just wanted to spend the lunchtime talking. At lunch, she approached Allan with her concerns. "I think I'm getting in too deep," she said. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to fall in love with you. We're getting serious. I know this is a temporary thing, and I don't want to have to deal with myself later if we continue to go on." "How do you know this is too serious?" Allan said. "I asked too much of you. I thought you were the one who said you gone into life and you just want to see what happens." "That's right, I did say that." "Well, I guess I'm caught in my own trap. It won't get too serious if we don't let it. I think the relationship is temporary too, but we gotta let it run its course." "Well, if you're not too worried about it, I guess it makes it half all right." But Candy knew what she was feeling. Even though Allan didn't want it to stop, Candy allowed herself to continue with the relationship, mostly out of fear of not being able to talk to Allan again without the concept of sex. Candy was relieved for a moment, though, as she and Pat were planning a long vacation to visit her parents in Georgia, which would give her most of April to sort out her emotions and what she was feeling and to discover how she really felt about Allan. But for Allan, he doubted that he was capable of falling in love with Candy. But for the first time, he felt like he needed her. They had something special, something that renewed each time they caught each other's eyes at church or touched hands over the table at lunch, or did something as simple as wasting time on the phone. Allan didn't find this affair to be affecting his life, though. His relationship with Betty was doing fine, and even hanging out with Pat was easy. He didn't feel like he was doing anything wrong. No one was getting hurt. After Candy left for her family vacation to Georgia, Allan unexpectedly missed her and wondered briefly whether her feelings would change while she was away, but he also felt a sense of relief. He hadn't realized until just a few weeks ago how much work an affair could actually be. When Candy returned from vacation, it was obvious that she missed him as much as he missed her. They made a date for the Kumo, but after lunch and sex, they spent most of their time catching up on each other's lives. One thing they talked about was Betty's pregnancy. Betty was 7 months along, and Allan was getting a little apprehensive. Betty would need a lot more attention as the days grew closer to the birth of their second daughter. It frequently crossed his mind that if Betty started having labor pains while he happened to be at the Como, he wouldn't be able to forgive himself. In June of 1979, Allan and Candy agreed to pause their affair because Betty was 7 months along and almost ready to give birth. He needed to be available for her at all times. Candy agreed completely. This was a sensitive time for Betty, and Candy understood that Allan needed to be there for her as her husband. Allan was shocked by how understanding Candy was in the situation. It made him wonder, what would it be like to be married to Candy? His life with Betty was stressful, and she wasn't easygoing, and Candy was. But as quickly as he thought about it, he immediately said no. That was out of the question. He knew that he would never divorce Betty, no matter what. Allan couldn't have realized, and Candy didn't tell him, but she was more than willing to suspend the affair all the while. Now, at the last visit, it confirmed her earlier fears. Sex was not great. They spent so much time talking about the physical part, and that was just routine now. She would never say so, but Candy also was tired of getting up early on the days they got together to make beef chow mein, cream puffs, ham and cheese casserole. Allan had come to expect notes and cookies and things left on his card too. The whole thing was becoming a hassle. She missed the magic of those first few weeks. At times, Candy would admit to herself that she felt guilty about Pat. He was oblivious to everything. She was certain he had no suspicion about her and Allan, even when they exchanged glances during worship service. Nevertheless, sometimes it was hard to be around Pat, just because he trusted her too much, and it didn't make it any easier when Pat can tell how much he liked Allan. Pat really liked him. They were friends. This group was going together, and as I said before, it was going to change the dynamic, and it was starting to. Candy's powers of deception were put to the ultimate test in mid-June when she threw a sit-down Chinese dinner for the choir as a surprise baby shower for Betty Gore. When Candy started planning the event, it didn't occur to her that this might be awkward, since she never felt uncomfortable around Betty, even though she was sleeping with Allan. She had everything planned, a special cake, everyone was bringing gifts, and Betty beamed with pleasure. It was one of the few times, in fact, that she seemed untroubled and at peace with herself. She was almost one of the girls. In July of 1979, Bethany Gore was born, and Betty seemed to perk up for a while. Betty and Allan grew closer, and they were overjoyed with having their second daughter. But their newfound, renewed intimacy was short-lived. They fell back into their old, miserable routine. Now that Allan didn't need to be on call all the time, there was really no reason for him to put off the affair any longer. But when he and Candy renewed their lovemaking at the Como in late July, it seemed different, lackluster. The sex was still good, Allan thought, but Candy was more reserved than usual. A couple times, she griped at him about little things that didn't matter. It wasn't like her. There was something else, too. For the first time, Allan was feeling guilty. He thought of Betty back at home taking care of their daughters by herself. He didn't feel good about himself. That week, after the baby was born, had been something special. He wondered if there was a way to get back to that, and he hoped he wasn't making it impossible by continuing to see Candy. Allan was grateful when Betty finally was well enough to travel, because that meant that they can take a week off and show the baby to Betty's parents. He wanted to be away from Candy for a few days, but wasn't prepared to tell her that. Before Allan left, they agreed to meet on the following Friday, since Candy knew she could get a sitter that day. The Gores didn't arrive home from their Kansas City trip until late Thursday night, and ordinarily, Allan would have taken the day off on Friday. But he knew that Candy really wanted to see him that day. If he didn't go to work, she would end up at the motel by herself, and the fallout could be devastating. But when Allan told Betty he intended to go to work on Friday, she objected, arguing that he should stay home and help her run errands. Not only was she insistent that he stayed home, she was more than a little suspicious on why he had to go to work. So Allan cooked up an excuse to call Candy, something to do with church. Then he phoned her from the kitchen while Betty was in the master bedroom at the back of the house. Without saying the words, he got the message across that he couldn't make it. Candy grew angry when she realized what he was telling her. Now, because her and Pat were leaving for a week-long vacation, which meant she wouldn't see Allan for another 2 weeks. Allan didn't want to hang up while she was mad, so he stayed on the phone for a few minutes, hoping she would calm down. When he hung up, he felt depressed and sheepish. He walked back to the bedroom. "Geez, that was sure a long conversation," said Betty. Candy and Pat spent the next week in Wichita Falls, and the following Friday, she met Allan at the hotel. After Allan spent the afternoon with Candy and had a long day at work, he was exhausted, and Betty wanted to make love. Her advance was more forward and aggressive than Allan had been used to, but he didn't have the stamina. He told her he didn't feel like it, and Betty began crying. She was embarrassed and humiliated and deeply hurt. It would have been different if she were in the habit of making advances, but to have the very first one kind of just dismissed was too much for her. She jumped to conclusions. Allan didn't love her anymore. He hated her because she was fat after having the baby. Allan tried to reassure her, but nothing worked. She'd been rejected and she couldn't stand it. On Monday, he called Candy. "I need to talk. When can I meet you and where?" They arranged to meet up for lunch, and Allan poured out the whole story of Friday night. Betty was very upset, he said. She kept saying, "You don't love me anymore. You don't love me anymore." "You did reassure her, didn't you?" "Yes." Candy began to cry. I think that's a little unfair of Betty to say a thing like that after you can't perform one time. It upsets me too. It's just that she made the first move. What are you going to do? I think we should end it. Now, you're being grossly unfair. I'm afraid of hurting Betty. I think the affair might be affecting my marriage now, and I don't want to do that. I want to get my life back in order. I have to stop running around between two women. But what about when I suggested we end it? Remember what you said then? You said, no, you have to see this through to the end. And just because something happens once doesn't mean it will happen again. And things that affect that. Now you can't perform one time with Betty and suddenly you want to end it. That's a double standard. I'm not saying we should definitely end it. I'm just saying we should think about it. I don't want to hurt Betty. Candy and Allan stood in silence a little while longer, not discussing the issue anymore, and parted ways. Over the course of the next few days, they talked several times by phone. Each time, Candy grew colder and more withdrawn. She couldn't bear the thought of Allan having so little regard for her feelings, but then she would cry and feel better and tell him that she loved him. I do love you, Allan. I know, but we've come too close. We've become so close that I'm afraid I don't love Betty anymore. And that was never part of our agreement. We've both been using each other to fill gaps in our marriage, and that's not right. It's just so unfair. After the Friday night incident, Betty Gore fell into a deep depression over the next several weeks. At first, Allan thought he could talk her out of it by spending more time with her. But soon she was complaining of soreness in her neck, shoulders, and sudden pains. She was depressed much of the time, especially after she returned from teaching in early September. She went to her family doctor, and he prescribed her pain pills to alleviate some of her complaints. As the month went on, Allan decided to quit his job and take a new one that would require less travel and allow him to be home more often. He felt like it was his duty to be home with her. Betty was going through this depression, and he didn't know what else to do. Until their friends from church talked to them about another solution. Now, this solution was called a marriage encounter. The friends from church went to Dallas and spent a weekend at a motel at a special marriage encounter session in which several couples talked about their marriage and tried to strengthen their commitment. Allan didn't understand exactly what went on, but he knew that his friends that went came back happier than ever. They said that they were hooked on marriage encounter and immediately were trying to get other couples to join. The couple told Allan, "You won't understand it unless you go experience it yourself." Allan knew the one thing they did need was something positive to reevaluate and regenerate their marriage. So one evening, Allan suggested it to Betty, that they should give marriage encounter a try. "Why do you think we need something like that?" she said. "I have so much to do already. You don't think that there's something wrong with us, do you?" He can tell that she was upset if he said yes. So he dropped the subject. When Allan talked to Candy, he told her that he got a new job, and because of the new job, the additional work, he wouldn't be able to see her as much. Candy was upset. She began to fear the inevitable, the end of the affair. She asked Allan if they could meet at their spot at least one more time. Back at the motel, they had a quick, unsatisfying sex, and then spent an hour and a half discussing how they could live without each other. Candy was clearly having second thoughts about breaking off the affair. She had grown too dependent on Allan's kindness. The next time they met, they didn't bother to go to the motel. Instead, they took their picnic to a park in North Dallas, spread underneath a tree with a blanket. The weather was so nice that it gave a bittersweet aurora to the conversation. "I love you so much, Allan. I don't know if I can make it if we break up." Allan didn't know what to say, except the usual things about wanting to patch up his marriage. "Betty wants to go to a marriage encounter now. I asked her once before, but she always said she didn't think we needed it. I think maybe it will do us both some good." "I think marriage encounter was going to be the end of us," Candy said. "Oh no, not necessarily. Let's see what happens first." As time went on, Betty was starting not to feel very great. She returned to her doctor's office, extremely tense, complaining of aches and pains in her shoulders. Her blood pressure was dangerously high, and her doctor prescribed her more painkillers and muscle relaxers. He asked her to come back in a few days. Betty knew a lot of the stress she was feeling was coming from what she and her husband were about to do that very weekend. She and Allan were about to go to be encountered. It was a crash course in marriage counseling designed to get couples to speak more openly about their issues and concerns. It was less like a counseling session and more like a total self-immersed experience. The weekend began on a Friday night where dinner was served. Now, again, this isn't like a counseling session. I don't know if you've ever been to a conference, you go to dinner and they have like a speaker, a keynote speaker. For this, the keynote speaker is going to explain the rules. Spouses are to be with each other at all times. Televisions were not to be turned on in the rooms. Newspapers were forbidden. Nothing was to get in the way of the couples communicating about their feelings. Communicating and feelings. Those were the watchwords of Marriage Encounter. As Allan and Betty found out soon after arriving, they were led to a large meeting hall with about 36 or so other couples and introduced to their encounter leaders, all married couples who had previously gone through the program. The couples on stage talked openly about their marriages, but no one else was allowed to speak except in the privacy of their rooms. The process was that the leaders would propose a question, and then the couples would go to their rooms and write the answers in their individual marriage encounter spiral notebooks. Once they written their answers, they would exchange the notebooks with a kiss and read each other's answers, and then they would discuss how those answers made them feel. When their time was up, they would come back to the main room for more reviews, followed by more questions. The group leaders gave them printed sheets to explain how to write a love letter, how to dialogue, what was a feeling, and ensure them that everything was to be written in the notebooks and that it was private. Now, like most couples in the encounter, Allan and Betty were skeptical at first. It sounded silly, writing things down in a notebook, but they were going to give it their all, and they began to write. Allan didn't know what to put down and sat there for a bit wondering until he wrote, "I want to come here so we can be friends. I want to strengthen and renew our bond. I think that I haven't felt really close to you for some time, and I don't like that. I hope I can learn to talk to you. I hope you can learn to talk to me. I want to be able to understand why you do the things you do, and I want to be able to tell you what I want." Now, Betty was more direct. "I came for several reasons. First, for a weekend of relaxation, which will probably help my nerves. Second, and most importantly, to get off by ourselves together. I'm not a person to be left alone. I want my husband with me, and that's what we'll have this weekend, just us. I hope to gain a little bit more freedom of expression between us. I don't often hold back my feelings unless I'm mad, then not for long, but I feel like sometimes you don't let me know when things are bothering you. We need to work on this." As they read over their answers and discussed what they had written, Allan was pleased to see that Betty was really responding to this program. After a few moments, one of the group leaders came by and knocked on the door. It was time for the next session. The encounter session was in full swing Saturday, and as the questions got progressively more personal, the group took on more of an appearance of love. Couples started emerging from the rooms with arms intertwined, holding hands during the meeting sessions, and exchanging light kisses at meals. The couples encouraged to not carry on any conversations with others without including their spouse entirely. Allan and Betty were certainly starting to get closer. Now, Sunday was the final and most special day of the encounter. It began with a religious service followed by more group sessions. Allan and Betty declared their love over and over, the couple sipping on the communion wine in the marriage encounter fashion, arms linked. Afterwards, in the emotional climax, they were all remarried in a ceremony in which led each through a traditional vow. The Gores ran one errand before returning back to Wiley. They stopped by the Montgomery house in Fairview to pick up Bethany, who Candy had kept for the weekend. So when they left, they asked if Candy can watch their daughter. Now, Allan went to the door while Betty waited in the car. "How was it?" Candy asked as she handed him the baby. "It was really good for us." "What does that mean?" "I don't know." The next morning, Allan was still riding the emotional high as he dressed for work. On the drive into Richardson, he tried to set out all the sensations except for thoughts of Betty. His life had changed. He wanted to concentrate all his thoughts and feelings on this marriage, which was once again the most important thing in his life. Yet when he got to work, he knew sooner or later he would need to call Candy. She wanted to meet for lunch. He had to face this head on. They met a week later. She brought a picnic basket and they went to the park in North Dallas. Allan did most of the talking. He told Candy all about Marriage Encounter and what it had done for them. We learned a lot about each other. I think maybe I was wrong about Betty in some ways. I think a lot of the things she doesn't like about me were based off of fears of loneliness instead of bitchiness. We told each other things that we didn't even think about. "That's good," Candy said. I'm glad. I don't necessarily feel different about you, Allan said. I do feel strongly that I want to give my full resources to my family. The relationship with you is taking away some of my emotional involvement and energy that I can direct towards Betty and the kids. I'm not sure how long this feeling will last or what will happen, but I do know I don't want to interfere with it. What does that mean for me? I'm not sure I can continue to see you, Candy. After making a strong argument he could for breaking up, Allan still couldn't bring himself to say the words. Candy came directly to the point. Allan, it seems like you're leaving it up to me, so I've decided I won't call. I won't try and see you. I won't bother you anymore. They both cried a little because they knew it was over. Allan was secretly relieved that she had made the decision and not him. That way he didn't have to bear the guilt. He hadn't planned for it to happen that way, but it just worked out. Candy had mixed emotions as well. She was telling the truth when she said she didn't know how she would deal with the loss of Allan. She had grown comfortable in the idea of loving two people. She loved Allan's casual phone calls and the small kindness, and she would miss him. The good news was that she didn't have to make any of those damn picnic lunches. A few weeks after the affair ended, Candy and Pat decided that they were going to attend Mirrored Encounter too. Though they did enjoy it, they didn't have any life-changing experiences that the Gores did have. The relationship with Pat was different for Candy. He wasn't what she wanted, and by going to Marriage Encounter, she learned that he would never be. By the summer of 1980, the affair was put well behind them, and it seemed that the Gores and the Montgomerys were going to move on from this situation without anyone finding out about the months-long affair that Candy and Allan had. But that was soon going to be changed in the next set of events. Thank you for listening to part 2 of the true story behind Love and Death. Now, in this episode, we did dive into the affair and the end of the affair in one episode. And my thoughts on this was, I think they both wanted to start this just simple, just about sex. But Candy wanted this affair to be much more than that. She wanted something passionate, vibrant, to kind of rock her world. And she didn't get that. But what she did get was someone that emotionally cared about her. And her husband wasn't. I think towards the end, Candy got a little aggressive in the situation and kind of felt like Allan was breaking up with her for his wife, which he was. That was his wife. It was never meant to get emotional. And for Candy, that hurt her. But she did move on from that. They went months without any altercation, anything happening. They kind of just went back to their normal lives. But in this next episode, we're going to go through the tragedy of where this story came from. Now, that brings us to the end of our show. As always, thank you for listening to Murder by Nature. If you enjoyed our show, please rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any streaming platform that you're currently on. And be sure to come back next Monday for our new episode. We'll dive into part 3 of the Betty Gore story. Until then, I am your host, Jasmine. Don't forget to stay safe. Don't get murdered or murder people, you lovely humans. Goodbye.